We are live. Folks who are joining us, feel free to just filter on in, get cozy, grab your coffee or tea or water, what have you. That was weird.
What's that?
Oh, you didn't hear it?
No.
Oh, I had like an echo from LinkedIn.
Oh, okay.
Interesting. Hello there, LinkedIn user. Gonna let people filter in here for the next few minutes. Welcome, welcome. Also a reminder to everyone, feel free to pop questions, comments in the chat. We want this to be a community experience, so Matthew and I have things to share, but those are certainly not the only interesting things.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. All right. What are you up to this morning, Matthew?
Just getting ready for this, thinking through some of those different times when I've run across nice versus kind, both in work situations and personal situations and things like that, kind of bringing them up to the front of my head so we can talk about them throughout the next hour.
Awesome. Me too, because I think that this work, along with, and I mean, kind of anything we do, even when we're talking about producing things and creating things, it overlaps into the quote unquote real world.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Actually, I witnessed this happening this morning. I just got a text from my partner who waited way too long to tell a friend of ours that we were not going to be doing the MS 150 bike ride this year for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's riding it alone. And I'm like, we should have told him like 2 months ago. But we were like,
yep.
I think both of us were kind of having this struggle of maybe we can make it work. Maybe we'll figure something out. And no, it just ended up delaying the inevitable. Right. And although the reasons are still valid, it's unfortunate and I feel bad.
And the thing that gets me about that is that invariably delaying those conversations and like trying to be nice instead of being kind of this sort of thing always tend to lead to actually harder conversations.
Yes. Like ends up making everything more difficult because he actually texted me about it maybe 2 weeks ago. And I was like, we're still trying to figure it out. And I didn't respond, which is not me. I am usually like, hey, I'm going to get back to you. And I froze. Because I was like, first of all, it's not my coworker. Secondly, but a mutual friend. I just kind of froze. And then you start feeling more bad. And it just, it leads to tougher conversations.
Yeah.
Welcome everyone who's joining us. We're going to get started here in about 1 minute and dig in to nice versus kind culture. I've been thinking about this so much lately because I'm working on a talk for a conference I'm going to in Manchester, which is about creating subcultures in ecosystems and kind of using punk as a metaphor for that.
So fun.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull in lots of UK punk fun things because I did it in DC with DC punk fun things. So.
Nice.
Yeah. All right. Well, it is the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Tara Scott with Industrial Logic. Joined with me here is Matthew Carlson, also with Industrial Logic. We're going to talk to you today a bit about nice versus kind culture. What does it really mean? What is the difference between the two? And the cost of stagnation versus honesty. I'll do a brief intro about myself, and then Matthew, I'll let you share a bit about yourself. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've been in tech for almost 12 years now. Let's see. I worked in healthcare for 10 years before getting into tech. And that's really where I started digging into behavioral practices and organizational psychology, organizational behavior. And when I came into tech, surprise, surprise, the same issues still exist and actually are multiplied because often in agile environments, we're expecting people to collaborate and be honest and all this stuff. And sometimes we do that and often we don't. And so that is a lot of the work that I do here at IL, and also work a bit with user experience design and product stuff, but they all kind of are roads that lead back to the home of behavior. So that's a little bit about me. How about you, Matthew?
Sure. I'm Matthew Carlson. I'm also a senior consultant with Industrial Logic. My background is actually a little bit varied. I started out very young as, in tech. I've actually been working with computers as of this year for half of the history of digital computing. Yeah. So a while. I had some of the same realizations you did. When I was a programmer and an engineer working on stuff, there were all of these problems, but it turned out they weren't technical problems. It was people and management and all of those, wibbly wobbly things that we have to deal with in technology. And so I went back, and my undergraduate degree is in business and administration. And during that time, I found a love for communication and communication theory. And so my graduate work was actually in organizational communication. And I kind of take those together so that I can have great conversations like this one. So
yeah. And I think you and I connected very early on, just because we've done a lot of similar work and have similar interests in this whole arena. So I guess let's dig into the topic today, nice versus kind culture. You and I have had plenty of conversations about this. We have also worked together on projects and products where these things come up. So I guess I'd love to talk a little bit about what you look at as the difference between the two. Because I've seen more and more articles actually coming into LinkedIn about like nice versus kind. And I always think, well, let's start by understanding what we actually mean by those words.
Right. Just because of who I am, I have a tendency to break things down into, kind of small pieces in my brain because it makes it easier for me to understand them. And so when I look at nice versus kind, we look at nice as like, oh, this is a good thing, right? It's being pleasant. It's being agreeable. You're having a bias for maintaining, kind of the immediate positive emotional and relational side of stuff. And all of that sounds really good. But the thing about it is that it's actually kind of a self-protective mechanism. It's a thing where it's like almost afraid to offend the other person or afraid to, maybe strain that relationship a little bit. And So it does tend to be very much the immediate, not the long term. It tends to be your own self protection as opposed to the other, that sort of thing, which contrasts it with kindness, which is really about being generous, considerate, caring about the other person, and biasing for overall well-being, both your own and the other person's.
Right. I love that you mentioned the biases for well-being, acknowledging that we're going to have them no matter what, right?
Yeah.
Biases are not a thing that we can just erase and say, we're not biased. We all are. There's not really a capability for us to remove that from our brain and say, oh, we're not going to be biased anymore. But if we bias more towards the overall well-being of people and being empathetic, making sure we're being generous, we're going to be able to have a focus on the quote unquote right kind of nice, or being kind, where it's not just about, I live in Minnesota and I talk about this fairly often with clients and when I do talks, but Minnesota nice is a huge thing. And we also call it Minnesota ice because it's painting on that smile and putting on that face that everything's great. You don't want to offend anyone. But the second someone leaves that conversation, it becomes a whole other deal. So let's say you're frustrated with someone, you don't say something about it, and there's three of you talking, and then the one person you have a problem with leaves, and the other two start to talk about it. So you're never really getting to the root cause of the issue, nor are you correcting it. Instead, you're just being nice to their face, but not being kind about whatever issue that might be, right?
Yeah, which means that it's never going to go away, right? It's just going to be this repetitive thing that goes on and on and on until it gets to a point where it breaks.
Exactly. And I think that what we have seen since the pandemic in 2020, I actually have been, I always call it my arsenal of data. I always love having data for this sort of thing because one, like total data nerd, and two, there's a real importance to recognize that soft skills as a term needs to go away because it's not a thing anymore. This is literally about us having, I hear people call it real skills and all these other things. Whatever you decide to call it, a healthy product is going to be a byproduct of how we communicate together. But I saw data from a report from Forbes that there's like a 252% increase in meeting times since February 2020. I think there's a few reasons for this, right? I think one is people trying to figure out how to interact with one another when we're doing some remote, some hybrid, some in person. But the other issue is not being direct about problems and going to meetings and having someone at the end say, well, let's circle back, which is also a very Minnesotan thing. We'll circle back about this, talk about it again here in a couple of days. But there's no fixed outcome. There's no ownership. And there's likely and often an elephant in the room that might even just be a tiny elephant. But to your point, Matthew, when we were talking earlier, right before we started, if we don't address that problem sooner rather than later, it just continues to grow. But I thought that statistic was staggering and embarrassing.
Yeah. And I've seen that same thing happen. I'm sure we all have, either the lack of consensus, and therefore we have to come back and revisit this problem because we're not actually talking about the thing that we're really talking about. Instead, we're, trying to skirt around it and avoid it. Or if we do actually get to it, then we get some kind of false consensus where we don't actually have agreement, but people are agreeing so that they can avoid the conflict. And then when you walk away from the meeting, then you go and you start triangulating with other people to undermine the decision and it means nothing gets done.
Right. Agreeing to agree. I think that people do it, one, because they're avoiding conflict, and two, because they're sick of being in meetings.
Yeah.
People will just say, you know what, it's fine. Like, let's just move forward. And I think that there is something to be said for picking your battles. But at the same time, how much time and money and energy are you wasting going around in circles, not getting to what actually needs to be said, what actually needs to be done?
Yeah. And I'm perfectly fine. I disagree and commit, hey, that I don't think this is the best course of action, but I'm willing to trust and see where it goes. Let's go for it. That's different from, yeah, I don't agree with this action, but I'm gonna be nice and say I do, and then I'm gonna undermine it, sometime as soon as we're walking away from here. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like you leave. I mean, how many of us have left a meeting where as soon as you leave, you're like, well, that was a terrible idea. It's like, well, then why did you sign up for it? One example that I love to use, and it's a bleak one, but it's very much so around groupthink. And for folks who aren't familiar with groupthink, it's the practice of, seeing the majority of people behaving in one way, you have an inclination to do the same thing because you don't want to be the outlier. You don't want to take up people's time. In the Challenger documentary that used to be on Netflix, I'm not sure if it's streaming there anymore. Oh my God, it's so well done, but it's devastating, of course. Within the first 5 minutes, I was like, my nervous system was not ready for this. But the guy who ended up pushing the fax button, if that dates it a bit, to give the Challenger the go for that flight the next day where the Challenger ended up exploding, he remembers viscerally sitting in a boardroom with the people who were funding this project and with other engineers, and all of the engineers knew it was a bad idea to say yes. But there was such immense pressure and they didn't want to waste people's time. So they just said yes. And by doing that, it had devastating effects. And while they may not always be that massive, these things have a ripple effect. And then it becomes a part of the culture of an organization is we don't want to directly address things.
Oh, yeah.
Let them spin.
I mean, I'm guessing all of us have been on at least one project, probably many, in our professional careers that were green, red.
Oh, yes.
It's not that it immediately turned, off the rails or whatever. People saw that coming. People knew that stuff was not going in the right direction, whatever. But, we don't want to say anything about that. It's, so we kind of paper over it until we can't.
Until you can't.
Yeah.
I have a visceral memory of being on the phone when I was an engineering manager, and I was on the phone with my director at about 11:30 at night, the day before this deliverable was due, that I had told him, this is not going to be done. And he said to me, well, I've been telling people it's going to be done. And I said, well, that was your choice. You knew what I had been telling you and what the team has been telling you for 3 months is that we'll have slices of it done. But if what your big picture image isn't matching up to what's actually complete, then no, it's not. And I think it really becomes that pressure cooker thing where leaders really, they're hoping just like somebody's going to pull through. It's kind of that, like, I almost think of it as like nihilistic optimism, where it's like, it doesn't matter. Let's just keep saying it's going to happen and maybe it'll happen. And then
I can avoid this hard conversation for one more day.
It's fine. And then you're met with an even harder conversation, because I really do think the emotional labor of being nice, of putting up that front, is exhausting.
Yeah, it really is.
And
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. Yeah. It's trying to maintain these relationships in a way where you're almost trying to, it's like walking on eggshells, actually. When I had decided for a moment that I might want to go into therapy, and I went into something adjacent, but there's a few books that are around the field of clinical psychology that talk a lot about walking on eggshells, because it's a practice that's so embedded within all of us, where if we've dealt with any sort of trauma, or you've had someone yell at you, or you've had a bad reaction to something, you're going to start to just kind of dance around whatever that topic is. So I guess I'd like to be clear that, like, being kind isn't always easy. In fact, a lot of times it's going to ask you to step outside of your comfort zone, because that's where the real work happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more.
Yeah. Oh, I see that we have a comment here from Brett. This is a really important point. When someone makes a commitment for you, it's not your commitment. Very true. As I am someone who has worked deeply with the responsibility process, I know, Matthew, you have too. Often, like responsibility, it's not really something you can give to someone. The only thing that you can really control is your own reaction. And that's where this gets tough. Because if you have an organization where everyone's being nice and you decide, you know what, I think it's time for us to address the real issue, that's going to require some bravery.
Yeah. And I think that, we've been spending almost half the time now talking about what it's like to be nice and what that can kind of do. But, there are times where you could take those exact same situations and change them and step forward and be kind. Right. The green, red project. You're not being kind to anyone by avoiding the hard conversations. You're not allowing leaders to get the information that they need to make better decisions. You're not you're adding to that pressure cooker that everybody knows is going to cause the pain going on, right, in that vain hope that you'll be able to avoid it somehow. And so really the thing that I find interesting about this is that we have this short-term gain from being nice. It very is just immediate making your, protection of yourself.
Yeah.
But for a long term, down the road, it's just going to be better. And so if you just step up and say, hey, wait a second, let's just look at reality here. Let me give the information to you that you need to do what you do. You're not going to, you're going to be unhappy with it, but that's okay. We'll deal with that. I see this with managers sometimes, that management is conflict. It's dealing with conflict.
Yeah.
That's just it. Management, you're either dealing with, you've got priority conflicts. So you have conflicts over resources like time, budget, scope. You have personality conflicts. You have conflicts over, needs for personal needs, business needs, team needs, all that. And so I've actually seen managers that want to be everybody's friend.
Oh yeah. It's like Michael Scott on The Office. It's like, I'm your best friend. And that's what this is. It's like,
yeah, but it's you. I'm not sure what they do as a manager, right? Because when you're in that situation, right, if you're avoiding conflict, then you're creating chaos, and you're not actually doing what needs to be done to make it better for everybody, to actually manage the situation and manage the environment and all those things. And so, yeah, I have so many examples in my head of both people who were nice in those situations and completely ineffective as managers and actually hurt people's careers, right? By not giving the feedback, by not doing that,
Exactly. And also like building resentment on the team.
Yeah.
If the team is witnessing one person being problematic, the leader or manager who isn't really leading, so we'll call them a manager, can't step up and have that conversation. That's going to be really tough. And I think that's where, like, if we talk about, we've talked about what nice looks like, which is, being passive or being passive aggressive, but what does kind look like? How do you start having those conversations? As a leader, I have certainly witnessed this, where folks are really practicing things like radical candor, if anyone who's listening is familiar, but it's really being able to care personally about someone, but being able to challenge them directly. And the example that I can give from a leader who I used to work with was witnessing him sitting down with another leader of ours. And it was all of us in a room. It was about 8 of us. And one of my colleagues was really waffling on whether or not to put someone on a PIP, on a performance improvement plan. And our senior leader kind of came in and said, I know you care deeply about this person, but it makes you a really ineffective leader if you're not able to grow your people. And it was a really visceral experience, I think, for all of us, but it was also super refreshing because he wasn't being disrespectful, but he was really painting the picture of this is the impact of what happens if you don't try and help this person out, and B, show the team that you're going to do something, and C, you're evolving as a leader because you're dealing with, just like you were saying, Matthew, all those levels of conflict. And I just silently in my head, I was like, yes, we talk about these things. This is great. And he ended up it was the first person he had ever put on a performance improvement plan. There were tears. It was really tough, but he walked through it. And at the end, we met like a week later and he said, I'm so glad I did that because now that I've done one, it's helped me get comfortable. It helps you get used to the sound of your own voice and being able to say things that need to be said.
Yeah. And even more so, it probably helped that person because the alternative was what? That it gets so bad that they just get fired without any warning.
Exactly.
None of us should have a performance review that is a surprise. None of us should be fired as a surprise.
No.
Right? That's it. That's not a failure of the person. That's a failure of leadership if that happens.
For sure. And I think that, people look up to leaders, or I think that is often the intent, right? But this is also this kind versus nice. Regardless of where you live on a team, this is not something you ask for permission for. This is something that you need to do internally. I do a lot of talks and started actually this conversation talking with you, Matthew, I talk a lot about creating subcultures within organizations and being able to take the reins yourself and say, where do I see, I can't take everything on, but what's something that I could start improving from my own behavior, which is exactly what we're talking about, being kind instead of being nice, and just start shifting the conversation a little bit so that I can experiment with, okay, if we're stuck in this meeting every week and we're not getting very far, what if I am a little more direct about X? Let's see what happens. And being able to kind of test it and see what can happen. There used to be many years ago, actually, when I first started in tech, there was an organization called DevJam in Minneapolis that was run by David Hussman. And we used to do an event every other month called Practical Agility. And the purpose of it was to really come and be forthcoming and have passionate conversations about the things that you're stuck on, and getting other people in the community to say, I'm stuck on the same thing too. What do you think that we could do to improve it? So I think if you are embedded in a team and you don't look at yourself as a leader, number one, I'm sure you're leading people in a way that you maybe can't even see. And number two, you don't have to do it alone. And that means not spinning on stuff and being negative, but who can you connect with to start making changes?
Yeah. And that is so important. I think most of us, most of the time, there just aren't very many good examples of nice versus kind or those sorts of things. We have a very, especially American culture, you Minnesota nice, Nebraska nice, Midwest nice in general. I grew up in Nebraska. It's just so pervasive. And I know that for me, the first time I really ran across what it felt like wasn't in a business situation. It was actually, I did combat sports for a while and for actually a long time. And I was working with a coach and I was in kind of a summer camp, and I went down and we were doing really intense drills, and I was afraid. I was, that I had anxiety about my performance. I had anxiety about being with this group of really highly skilled people in something I was learning. And it was combat, I was getting hit, and we did this drill, and I went into it and I got smacked across the back, and it felt like basically being whipped.
Yeah.
And it hurt and it stung. And my reaction to it was to start screaming and yelling and stomping off the field and throwing my equipment off. And the coach walked over to me, and he this was the first time that I really felt kind versus nice, because he didn't say, oh, are you okay? Oh, okay. What can you do? What he said was, are you hurt or are you injured? If you're injured, we need to take care of that. We need to know what's going on. If you are hurt, that the way you're acting is completely inappropriate.
Yeah.
And it stopped me. And it's like, oh, wait a second. And it took me a while, because I was like, it was uncomfortable. It was whatever. All of these feelings came up. I was definitely uncomfortable with it. But that was like the really first time that I saw the difference between uncomfortable and unsafe, because the first thing he did was check on my safety.
Yep.
And make sure that I was any safety concerns were taken care of. But let me be uncomfortable. And the second one was nice versus kind, because he very could have easily let me continue acting that way. And instead, what he did was let me know what's appropriate in the situation.
Yeah.
That if I continued acting that way, people were going to look at me differently than I wanted them to. Those sorts of things. And so it was this really, really powerful moment that I still viscerally feel today, and that I've tried to be that kind of leader once I understood what that meant.
I love that story. And I think it's so humbling to have those experiences where you do something that isn't going to be helpful for you or other people, and someone shows you and you can absorb it. Yeah. Because there are plenty of times that happens that when we can't, right? Because being kind, it's like we mentioned, it's not easy. I'm certain that, the trainer you were working with didn't immediately start from a position like that when he first began his career. It's like everything else. It takes practice. It's being intentional about our behavior and saying, if we want to continue to move things forward, what sort of language do I have to use to ensure that sort of thing happens? Yeah. That being said, I know we're getting close to wrapping up here. We've got just a few minutes left. What else do you want to add, Matthew, around this? We talked a bit about, what this can look like when we want to propel things forward. What about for folks who are really feeling stuck, where it's like this, our whole organization, they all do this. What do I do?
I think the first thing that I would say, and interestingly enough, this is actually from that same coach.
Okay. Love that.
At one point in time, he looked at me and said, okay, just remember, this isn't about making them better. This is about making me better.
Yeah.
Okay. That's my job, is not to make everyone else in the world a great leader. My job is to continue making myself a better leader incrementally as I go over time. And so this all starts with yourself and just saying, okay, cool. Where am I biasing for my self-protection and being nice? Where am I biasing for really caring about others and being willing to be uncomfortable to help them? And not everybody else in the world is going to do that, but you can change the world by doing it yourself.
I love that. That's awesome. I would mirror that and say, I also love that all came from the same person for you. I would mirror that by saying, it's not our job. We can't sit and wait for things to happen to us, because it's not going to happen. If we want to see change, we have to be willing to step outside of our comfort zone and do those sort of things. That being said, I also recognize that you have to have the tools to be able to do those things. I think that looking for opportunities where it doesn't feel super scary, but low hanging fruit. If there's a meeting where you can tell everyone's bored and there's one thing that you can play with, just play with your own response and your own behavior and see if you can't make some suggestions of like, okay, who's owning what as we get off this call? Because maybe you never hear things like that. Or do we actually have an agenda for this? Start with small slices and build your way up. What I'd also like to add is, if you want to talk more about kind versus nice, and things that are related to actionable psychological safety, we actually do have a workshop coming up. I have just put it up there on the banner. It's our actionable psychological safety workshop. Our next one starts September 9th. It is 5 weeks, 2 times a week. So we try and work as much with people's schedules as we possibly can to ensure that folks can both work and be able to focus on the content that we're going to teach you. And what that really looks like is giving you practices to learn to start experimenting in real time, both with your organization and in your life, and then coming back towards the end of the week and really measuring what you experimented with. What did you hypothesize? What did you want to change? What practices did you use? It's work that I'm super proud of. We've all, spent a lot of time and energy continuing to adapt and change this stuff to make sure that people recognize that really it's up to us to be able to change these issues with culture, starting with our own behavior, so that we can practice things that are less about being nice and more about being kind and growing together. Yep. So I see we're at time. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me on this. Everyone who listened, thank you so much for joining us again. I will share a link on LinkedIn to the Actionable Psychological Safety Workshop. If you are interested in signing up for that, you can get on the list. We would love to see you there. Otherwise, have a fantastic day. And thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you for having me. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.